Hello and welcome. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story, our independent platform that does a deep dive into the most important and pressing issues of our time. Today, we look at the spiraling situation in Afghanistan that is simply not getting as much of the world's attention and India's attention as it needs to. What's happening in Afghanistan comes even as the Taliban have vandalized the Sikh flag at a Gurudwara and also taken control of a key provincial town in Afghanistan. Let's bring up our big story that we're focusing on the program today. The Taliban has captured two provincial capitals and India has objected to its vandalization of a Gurudwara. This is, of course, what the Taliban is known for and notorious for, and it is all playing out in front of our eyes, even amid a push that India needs to engage with the Taliban. The Afghanistan government's media director has also been assassinated in a targeted assault by the Taliban, once again reminding the world of the situation that Afghanistan has been left to grapple with as the Americans get ready to leave. The civilian casualties are mounting, and a woman activist from Afghanistan described to me the situation to be a genocide of the Afghan people in the making. But as all of this is happening, there is clear danger of a China Pakistan axis emerging. India has said that terrorist safe havens must be disrupted. But all of this is happening even as there are reports that India is already engaging on the quiet with the Taliban. Like always, we're taking a closer look at the situation in Afghanistan, the horrors that it means for the world and for this region of South Asia in particular. And we're also asking how India should respond and is there any room for morality when it comes to diplomacy. Let me introduce a very, very special panel of eminent guests on the program today. Happymon Jacob is with us, a strategic affairs analyst who has been advocating that India should talk to the Taliban, something he and I have been arguing about for a long time. We're also joined by one of the foremost experts in the world of academia on Afghanistan, Avinash Paliwal from the University of London. I'm very pleased to have with us also Ambassador TCA Raghavan, who has also served as High Commissioner to Pakistan. Remember, for both Afghanistan and India, the role of Pakistan is critical. Pakistan really seen to be the patron saint of the Taliban. Also joining us is well-known journalist Andrew North, who spent a lot of time reporting on all things Afghanistan and Pakistan. And finally, it is an honor to have with us on the program Ambassador Ashraf Haidari, who is Afghanistan's ambassador to Sri Lanka. And I will start with you, Ambassador Haidari, if I may. Obviously, the Afghan people are fighting back. The Afghanistan government is fighting back, but things are not looking good. We are seeing provincial capitals fall. We are seeing the Afghanistan government's media director assassinated. We are seeing places of worship, vandalized, including a Gurudwara. If you had to assess the overall situation in the standoff between the Afghan forces and the Taliban, what would you first tell our audience is happening on the ground?
Well, the government and people of Afghanistan have been fighting the Taliban for the past 20 years, and especially so over the past 2 years. What you're seeing happening is not new. This has been happening for years, and at least over the past 2 years, something that our strategic partners, close allies in the region and outside the region have been observing, because they maintain very robust missions on the ground, witnessing what has been unfolding in Afghanistan, unfortunately, following the announcement by the Obama administration of the US and NATO troop withdrawal. So we've been pushing back and fighting back, defending Afghanistan as what we consider a genocidal terror campaign imposed on Afghanistan. Remember, the Taliban are not alone. There's a whole state structure behind the Taliban, joined by regional and transnational terrorist groups from the region. We know so many have come from across the door line from Pakistan, including Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jundullah, Ansarullah, and so forth, as well as also ETIM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, focusing mostly on China, as well as Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, of Haida, and under all of this umbrella also Daesh is operating. Sometimes the Taliban use them interchangeably as a label name to refuse to accept certain terrorist attacks, gruesome terrorist attacks that they launch on civilian targets, but other times, of course, they let them claim it. And so that's where the situation is. Yes, the Taliban have captured some districts, some villages. Now, of course, Zaranj, where there wasn't much resistance simply because our forces have been fighting in multiple battlefields, multiple fronts across the country, as also the Taliban continue targeted killings. We just saw
Yeah.
recently that they assassinated a senior civilian official, which is a clear war crime. And we also saw yesterday the meeting of the United Nations Security Council under the Indian presidency, where the whole international community once again reaffirmed their commitment to the peace process in Afghanistan, calling on the Taliban and indirectly calling on their state sponsor to discontinue this, spate of violent attacks and
Yes.
offensives, mostly, of course, targeting innocent civilian populations. We have had just
Sorry to jump in there, but I'm struck by the fact, Ambassador Haidari, that among the terror groups that you named, Daesh, of course, which the Western world calls ISIS, but that you also mentioned the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Lashkar-e-Taiba. You believe that these are part of the terror groups that are giving the Taliban infrastructural support as well as men to fight. This is so important because in India, there is one section of opinion that is arguing that India must engage with the Taliban. And the terror groups that you name have directly launched war more than once against Indian interests. Your assessment of this coming together of this disparate network of terror groups, is there a centralized control over them? Is that coming
there's
from Pakistan? What is your reading?
there's there's absolutely none. I really wonder what Indians mean by India engaging with the Taliban, which is by no means monolithic. Of course, if India engages with anyone, should engage with Pakistan. India being a strategic ally of Afghanistan. Remember, the government of Afghanistan, people of Afghanistan signed this strategic partnership agreement with India back in October 2011 at huge costs simply because we share democratic values, interests, and connectivity, and win-win stabilization and development of Afghanistan, where India, Pakistan, and as well as Central Asia collaborate, cooperate to invest and trade and so on and so forth, which
Yeah.
was on the agenda of the recent regional connectivity conference in Central Asia, and was also discussed in the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization foreign ministerial meeting, where it
Mhm.
mostly focused on security. Where now, of course, ACO being inclusive, including India and Pakistan and other major players. As NATO withdraws, now here is a vacuum for the ACO to fill in, because remember, China, Russia, and Iran, which is an observer, I've been, and of course, Pakistan as well, that if what the NATO withdraws from Afghanistan, the Taliban would, step forward. One of
Right.
their core conditions that would make peace with their brothers and sisters, and
Right.
then as a result, the launch of the Doha process, which is
So,
unfortunately
so
failed.
there's lots.
Failed
There's
meaning. Mhm.
Yeah, hang on, Ambassador. There's a lot you're packing into your response, and I understand there's a lot to discuss. But two really important things that in what you've said. One is this sort of disparate network of terror groups that are operating already in support of the Taliban. The second, a kind of urging India not to engage with the Taliban, but to prevail upon Pakistan, which is seen to be the patron saint of many of these terror groups. I just want Ambassador TCA Raghavan to come in immediately in response to this, having served as High Commissioner to Pakistan, knowing Pakistan inside out. What are our options, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, at this point? And there is such a push from a section of India's strategic community that we can't be left out. The FOMO, the fear of missing out in terms of what happens to Afghanistan, is calling for India to engage with the Taliban. I mean, can we do this? What good would it do to us, and what would it do to our position against terrorism in the region?
Well, in my view, the question is not an ethical or a moral one when you engage with a particular stakeholder or a particular party. The fact is, you have been part of a certain concert in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, and that concert is now facing uh, a situation of great stress because of the battlefield gains of the Taliban. You can't simply switch sides because in the end you will not gain from that switching off sides. You can't run with the hounds and hunt with the hares, or hunt with the hounds and run with the hares at the same time. It's just not a practical proposition. The fact is, you have been a major beneficiary of the new change which came about in Afghanistan 20 years ago. And to a great extent, you identified with that positive change. Now there are forces which seek to reverse that change. And the question of our protecting our interests by switching sides, therefore, is really mixing up the central issue which is unfolding in Afghanistan today. Countries which have engaged with the Taliban have specific interests to protect when they did so. The British started engaging with the Taliban about 15 years ago because they wanted to protect their soldiers from attacks. The United States is engaged with the Taliban today because it wanted a safe withdrawal. You have totally identified your interests with the current dispensation in Afghanistan. Now, certainly there is a question mark over that dispensation, but there is no way you can protect your interests by switching sides or by hedging at this stage. And while certain tactical dealings with stakeholders is always takes place and is certainly necessary, that does not really sum up your, or cannot sum up your policy. As far as
Can I,
Pakistan is
yeah,
concerned,
before you come to Pakistan, can I ask you, Ambassador Raghavan, the argument or the countervailing argument, and which you agree with, is that this cannot be an ethical or a sentimental decision. It has to be one guided by strategic interest. And there are those, and we'll hear from Happymon in just a moment, who would argue that two things have already happened. One, in the Moscow talks, India has sat at a table where the Taliban have also sat in 2018. And two, Qatar says that India is already in contact with the Taliban. So there are those who would argue that instead of doing this covertly, you may as well do it overtly. It doesn't mean you're backing them. It simply means you're engaging with them as one of the groups. I don't agree with this, but I'm wondering whether you do.
well, as I said, tactical engagement, because you have certain specific areas which you want to be extra careful about. Certainly, that always happens. But the fact is that there is no way you can advance your interests by engaging with a group whose priority on behalf of Pakistan has been to reduce your presence in Afghanistan. There is no way you can pull a rabbit out of a hat just now, because the fact is that it has been Pakistan's central agenda to reduce the Indian footprint in Afghanistan, and the Taliban has been their principal instrument for doing so. Now, that is the principal engine or the major issue at play here. So while you can work around that, as I said, at a tactical level, but that central factor that you have been part of a concert which is today under stress,
Yeah.
and you cannot change that quickly, that central factor is, to my mind, not going to change very quickly.
I will come to the role of Pakistan in a moment, but I want Happymon to jump in at this point. Are you still convinced, as you wrote and argued on this program, that India should be talking to the Taliban, even after hearing both Ambassador Haidari and Ambassador Raghavan?
No doubt about the fact that we are saddened by the loss of lives in Afghanistan. We are looking at the human rights violations committed by the Taliban, and we are sad about it. There's no question about it. But I think as a country, we need to sit back and must reflect about our strategic interests in the region with more, with more considerations about what might happen if we do not engage some of the actors that are gaining power in the region. Now, I think there are three questions here. If you give me a minute, I'll sort of try to approach them separately. I think, first of all, there is a moral question about, as you correctly put it, engaging morally reprehensible actors. The second question is really about if it's a foreign policy question, whether it makes sense for India, strategic sense for India to talk to the Taliban, and finally, is it sensible to talk to the Taliban, which might incorrectly appear as abandoning the Ashraf Ghani government? Now, let's come to the first question, which is the moral question about engaging the Taliban. Can one justify the Taliban atrocities? No. Can moral standards apply to all situations in foreign policy behavior? Perhaps not. But let me unpack that a bit in 10 seconds. What is the moral argument against the Taliban? That it is an Islamist fundamentalist group that violates human rights of the Afghans. That is true. However, states, including India, engage in conversation with groups, states, or entities that violate human rights of its people or other people? Yes, we do. Do we shun the Chinese for running internment camps in Xinjiang? Of course not. Do we engage the Iranian fundamental regime despite its human rights record? Of course not. What about the North Korean regime? Of course not. What about the Pakistani state? The Pakistanis, using their proxies, have killed scores of Indians. Do we engage them? Of course we engage them. So I think the moral argument is that the reality is that states have routinely picked and chosen who to engage and who not to, despite their human rights record. So I think that's
probably the advantage. All right, I'll put the morality aside, which I find very uncomfortable to do so, but what's the advantage?
Let's put it this way. I think not talking to the Taliban is more disadvantageous than not. Let's say if you don't talk to the Taliban, I think that's going to be more disadvantageous than perhaps the advantage that you get from talking to the Taliban. Let me sort of explain that. The fact of the matter is that our biggest interest is that there should be no blowback effect on us in terms of the extremist activity in Kashmir or in the rest of India from a blowback effect of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Now, Ambassador Haidari himself mentioned you are looking at entities like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, etc., active in Afghanistan. To my mind, that's all the more reason why we should reach out to the not so monolithic Taliban that there is, and reach out to some of them and talk about our interests. There have been statements coming from the Taliban in the past, including from Abbas Tanaksai, the head of the Doha delegation, who is a former IMA graduate for that matter, about the need to engage India. So I think, first of all, the impact of the terrorism itself, and secondly, the concept that Ambassador Raghavan talked about, and I do agree with that. The switching sides may seem a little uneasy, but the reality is that who is on our side at this point of time? The Americans are talking to the Taliban.
Can I jump in for a second? Because I served in India.
Yes, I was going to come to you for a brief response, Ambassador Haidari, before I go to Avinash and Andrew.
With all due respect, it's really stupid, and not just a matter of morale. It's just a matter of India's best long-term interests. You need to choose what defines India. You remember, of course, Afghanistan back in the 1990s. I wonder why India back then didn't engage with a much more, of course, pliant Taliban. This is not the Taliban of the 1990s, my friend. This is, if you just take a trip to Afghanistan, I would dare you to take that trip and to be, of course, sitting at your embassy behind the, bunkerized walls. This is not that Taliban that you are talking about. It's much more lethal, much more destructive, of course, and executing summarily Afghan surrendered forces, genocidal acts of terrorism. There is, an international system. There's the United Nations. You're holding the presidency of the United Nations Security Council. You have a responsibility under the United Nations Charter, Chapter 7. For God's sake, we signed this strategic partnership agreement with you. Afghans have been bleeding for India. India has been making tens and hundreds of millions of dollars from Afghanistan. Do you understand that 5 planes of Afghans going to spend in India every single day? India has been pursuing a policy of connectivity, policy of sustainable development, of helping connect South Asia with Central Asia. That's what is in the best long term of interest of India. Not propping up, not talking to a terrorist network of regional and global nature. You're not U.S. Look at what happened to the U.S. when Bill Clinton said it's all about jobs. It's the economy is stupid, and then Bush second came, and then left, and then of course Biden stepped in, and they're leaving. But you're in the neighborhood. Our destinies are intertwined. Our futures are intertwined. This region, Afghanistan, being right at the heart of it, absolutely has implications for India. You cannot just sit on the sidelines and engage with a terrorist, network which has no vision, absolutely nothing. Today they're
Ambassador
shooting left
Haidari,
and right on the
I
streets of
personally,
Kabul. Please don't tell me
I
this as an Indian.
I personally do understand that rage that is coming through and that sense of abandonment. And another Afghan friend said to me about Biden, he has no honor or conscience when it comes to the Afghan people. I know the Afghan people do expect better from India. Happymon, hang on. I need to get the others to be part of this conversation. Avinash, go ahead. This is, there is nobody I know in Afghanistan who doesn't feel this. But Indian diplomats and strategic thinkers are trained to not be sentimental in the way that somebody like myself can be sitting outside of this space looking in. For me, I can't divorce the morality. I can't divorce the question of how women are treated by Afghanistan, how minorities are treated. But Happymon does well to remind us that we talk to the Saudis and they just assassinated Jamal Khashoggi, and there are many other terrible regimes that we do engage with. Avinash, please go ahead.
Barkha, firstly, thank you for having me on the show this afternoon. Morality is very much part of any calculation or even international relations, whether we put it out as a witting, in a witting manner or unwittingly. So though there are very powerful international norms that define how states behave. So I would disagree slightly that morality doesn't have a role in international politics. I would say emotions, morality, sensitivity, it's actually much more powerful a driver often of policy than the so-called realpolitik that we focus on in terms of clinical relationship with whoever is in power, regardless of their political and moral make. That's one point. But having said that, it's true that states, including India, have engaged with entities whose moral quotient is, it's questionable. I work on Myanmar right now, and I know that India is very openly engaging with the junta, which is killing its own people. So as far as India's foreign policy and morality goes, and not just that of India, most countries, I respect that point, but I'll keep that aside a little bit. I sympathize with the dilemma in New Delhi right now of whether or not to talk to the Taliban. There is very compelling reasons why perhaps many people in New Delhi feel that some tactical engagement perhaps should happen. I would be cautious before saying India should openly engage with the Taliban, echoing the kind of sentiments and the points that Ambassador Haidari has mentioned, and even Ambassador Raghavan has mentioned. You do not switch sides. We need, if India ever talks to the Taliban, whether it's covert, whether it's tactical, whether it's a much more kind of comprehensive conversation, we need to be politically very clear that we are one on side of the Kabul government. We are in support, in principle, of the Republican camp of the Islamic Republic. There is no compromises to be made on that count, some very fundamental count. Secondly, that if we want to have an inclusive government, India should actually come up with a formula that it has in mind of what kind of inclusivity politically it is really talking about, right? The other point of this problem that has to be appreciated a little bit more, and Ambassador Haidari hinted at it in uncertain terms, is Taliban's own calculation. Happymon did mention that there have been statements made in the past. There have been, I would not really put too much on the fact that Stanexai got trained in the Indian Military Academy in the 80s. It was a very different era, which cannot be equated today. But he's correct. There are many individual leaders, perhaps certain factions, who would be very open to talking to India. But the problem for them, the Taliban's dilemma, is much more difficult than that of India. At least we have allies. We have the concert of allies in Kabul and internationally. So the Taliban, the moment they will be seen coming to visiting New Delhi or sharing a platform openly with Indian officials, I think that will really complicate the relationship with Pakistan. If Pakistan is the key patron here, they have to respect their relationship with Pakistan. And I think that's a much more fundamental, it's a life and death question for them as well.
I think that's a very interesting point. I just want to bring in Andrew here on the China-Pakistan nexus that is emerging. Let's not forget a few things. China's, top government officials hosted the Taliban. the Taliban hasn't just inflicted a kind of genocide on the Afghan people. It has also killed one of our own. Let us not forget what happened with Danish Siddiqui, the Reuters photojournalist. Let us also not forget that when Ambassador Haidari talks about this network of terror groups, how are we assuming that engagement with the Taliban will not lead to a spillover for us as a country? Andrew, you've been sort of studying and reporting from most of these countries for a long time. Go ahead.
And also the other thing I'd say is over the years, many Indian workers, Indian diplomats have also been casualties over the years, over the last 20 years or so, of Western-led intervention. So, and India all that time, of course, has been putting in a lot of investment. I think just to step back a bit, though, on this crisis, I think there's a need to see just how little the outside world is doing. The India, as the current head of the Security Council, is absolutely in position to try to push for more measures. But consider a contrast with, say, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. The way that, of course, America leading it, but using the Security Council to then implement a whole series of measures. There have been statements from the United Nations so far, but to some extent it's sidelined, and everyone's talking about talks, but the Taliban can read the signals, and at the moment they can see that there are no serious costs to them continuing their offensive. And so as long as that situation continues and people discuss whether or not to talk to the Taliban or not on the sidelines, then the situation is going to carry on the ground. I mean, for me as a journalist following this, I would say, of course, India should be talking to the Taliban because it needs to be thinking about its interests. And, as other colleagues on the program are pointing out, India talks to all sorts of other countries. That's not the point. India can still stick to its principles while and make more of sticking to its principles while also having contacts with the Taliban. But what is needed here is a much greater and more clear-cut international involvement, meaning real sanctions. Otherwise, the Taliban at the moment are clearly, they have the momentum.
Okay, that's an important reality check. I'm not sure Ambassador Haidari would agree with that, but Ambassador Raghavan, I think it is important to respond to Ambassador Haidari's very angry sort of response to the suggestion that there should be legitimacy according to the Taliban, which is sort of different from what all states do, which is a certain kind of back channeling. Those are two very different things. Go ahead, to pick up on all that you've heard. You're on mute, sir.
Clinically,
yeah,
what is playing out is, and this has been a 20-year conflict in its current phase, is Pakistan making a re-entry into Afghanistan using the Taliban as a front. I think that is the longer-term process at play here, and very clearly, India is going to be a loser in this process. There is no way you can square that circle by any act of policy making on your part. You will the situation will change only when there is a larger shift which will take place in the regional situation once the Taliban shows its true colors. I don't agree entirely with Happymon when he talks about Stanik Zai and the other Taliban based in Doha, because I think this is a force which has been radicalized by fighting for 20 years on the ground, based from sanctuaries in Pakistan. These proxies who speak for them in Doha, we cannot take them as being representative of the spirit of this force, because any situation of conflict radicalizes an organization even more than it was in the past. So I think there is something in what Ambassador Haidari said, that the Taliban of the 90s and the Taliban of the current stage of the conflict may in fact be different in character, and we have to take that into account. So I see it is most unfortunate, and I see the reasons why Ambassador Haidari and so many other Afghans feel so terrible about this and are so passionate about this. But there is a shift taking place on the ground because of the precipitate withdrawal of the United States and the confusion and demoralization that has led to. Unless there is a change in the battlefield situation, I don't think the diplomacy or the politics or the high politics is going to alter the reality.
Let me get Ambassador Haidari to come in, and then Happymon can pick up his very angry response to Happymon's suggestion. The argument by Ambassador Raghavan and Ambassador Haidari is that even if India stood with your government and with your people, that in itself would not change the outcome of what looks like is going to happen unless something either militarily shifts or, as Andrew said, unless the world comes together to stop it from happening. Go ahead, Ambassador Haidari.
Well, I agree with the three previous speakers. Of course, morally, the international community, especially India, democratically speaking, of course, our friendship, our ties, all the Kabuliwala stories that I experienced and I heard from rank and file of India, etc., that applies. And but also, strategically speaking, I think it's just not an issue of moral obligation, but it is, like I said, in the short, medium, and long-term interests of our neighborhood and the broader international community to strengthen the hand of the Afghan state, the hand of the Afghan nation state, and a system of international nation states, right? So remember, we are not discouraging any engagement with the Taliban as far as it is within the framework that has been worked out. The Doha Agreement, remember, we were not a party to it. We released 5,500 plus prisoners, including war criminals and drug traffickers. The Afghan government wasn't willing to do so, but we held a jorga and then we consulted with the people. People authorized it, as of course, because of the coercive mediation pressures. We did that for the sake of peace. And the United States is also, for good or worse, they have also now withdrawn. Now, the Taliban are really left with no excuse but to deliver on their own commitments. Remember their commitments under the Doha Agreement, which was negotiated for almost 2 years and then signed in front of the international community, that they would reduce violence, that they would commit to a ceasefire, hold results oriented talks, and move on. Unfortunately, that has not materialized. So where we want India engaged, we really want India engaged in the right ways, right?
Yeah.
Supporting the implementation of the Doha process, supporting the implementation, the enforcement of declaration after declaration after declaration, in which India itself has been an active participant. Look at the, a statement from the extended Troika, for example, which includes India. We've been advocating for India to be included in that. But if you even look at that, it is full of these commitments that we want the international community to deliver on. And like Andrew said, without punitive action at the end of the day, and just agreeing with everyone, of course, the state and sponsor of terrorism would not discontinue from engagement in Afghanistan. So the United Nations Security Council has to stop talking, but start walking the talk, and that begins from punitive action under Chapter 7, which is the smart targeted sanctions, sanctioning individuals in a specific state institutions of our neighborhood.
Let me just get responses to what you said.
Drive this, imposed conflict of genocidal scale in Afghanistan.
And I think it's also important. I think it's also important for our part of the world to understand, Happymon, that this is not just about the Afghan people. This is about this region. This is about an emboldened Pakistan. This is about terror groups and their spillover effect. And I do not know why India is not framing the conversation in those terms. Do you accept that any engagement with the Taliban, as Ambassador Raghavan and even Ambassador Haidari is now saying, would have to be in the framework of which side we're on?
You know, Barkha, I think we are trying to make a bad situation slightly better here. We do not have a fantastic geopolitical situation in our hands at this point of time. We are going to be in the line of fire, whether we like it or not. Once the Americans pull out, once Taliban gains more power in Afghanistan, like it or not, the Russians are where they are, the Chinese are where they are, the Americans are where they are. We are right in the middle of it in one way or the other. Of course, the Afghan people are also right in the middle of it. So, are we trying to sit back here and engage in some moral talk and spew out some nice sounding sentences and words? Is that going to help us? I don't think so. I think that's precisely why, just like Ambassador Haidari is concerned about his country's national interest, and I completely see where he's coming from. I think India has also a right to think about its own strategic interest and where things are going to end up in the days for India. I mean, when he himself said, for example, there are certain ways that you can engage the Taliban. I completely agree when I say that New Delhi should engage the Taliban, and I think many of the participants here are saying some one way or the other you may have to reach out to the Taliban. I'm not saying that India should recognize the Taliban. Who is India to recognize the Taliban? I am not saying that India should condone Taliban's atrocities. Who is India to condone Taliban's atrocities? No. I'm simply saying, just like Ashraf Ghani said the other day, and he quoted Lincoln saying that the best way of treating an enemy is to turn him into a friend, and he called on the Taliban for a ceasefire. Absolutely, India should do all of that. All that I'm trying to say is that sitting back.
Okay, hang on. We've lost you, but we've got the gist of your
Trying to do
argument,
that
Avinash.
8 down the line, 6 down the line. I think that's not the smart way to go. In any case, last point, Barkha. In any case, the government of India has been engaged with the Taliban one way or the other. I mean, what should be the contours of those talks? I'm not sort of dictating the terms of that.
But I actually, let me argue this from another point of view to Avinash. I think it upends our position on terrorism. After decades of there's no good Taliban and bad Taliban, there's no good terrorist and bad terrorist, to suddenly sort of accord the Taliban this legitimacy with direct consequence for India, with the kind of terror networks from the ISIS to the Al-Qaeda to the Jaish to the Lashkar, most of whom have safe havens inside Pakistan. How is this serving our self-interest? I agree with Happymon that we don't have a bunch of options, but how is engagement serving our self-interest, Avinash?
Barkha, we need to figure out to what extent the Taliban enjoys policy autonomy when it comes to power, if it comes to power. First of all, let me kind of put in a bit of more caution to this idea of Taliban having a strategic momentum which is irreversible. We have seen very serious pushback from the Afghan forces. We have seen very serious pushback from regional power holders, including Ismail Khan in Herat and other power holders elsewhere in the country. There is a lot of fighting. It is true that the Taliban is going for the provincial capitals for population centers, but there are very few capitals that has actually been able to take and hold. And that is something that I think in the larger narratives, international narratives of on the situation in Afghanistan, it is not being appreciated that the Republic is actually fighting back despite all its problems that we love to highlight, and which of course requires highlighting for a variety of different reasons. That's one thing. As far as India is in no position to legitimize or delegitimize the Taliban. Let's be very clear. This is a movement which has already been legitimized by the United States. This is a movement which is already engaging in open public diplomacy with a variety of powers, both regional and extra-regional. So as far as India's own position is concerned, if India decides to talk openly to the Taliban, I think it's more in terms of how India sees its own interests in Kashmir and elsewhere, and the partnership that it has built with Afghanistan itself, but more so also the India-Pakistan relationship itself. We often forget that it is actually Pakistan that is India's problem when it comes to the Afghan question, and not Afghans itself. And let's be very clear, India's bilateral relationship with Pakistan is nowhere close to any serious resolution on most of the issues. And unless there is some conversation going on between Islamabad and New Delhi in earnest, this dilemma that we are talking about in Afghanistan will never resolve. So to that effect, I actually agree with Ambassador Haidari that India should actually talk with the Pakistanis rather than trying to talk with the Taliban. That is not happening.
I think that's a very important point, and also the important reminder from Avinash that there's actually a strong pushback, and we've all seen those very moving videos coming out of Kabul in particular, where you had slogans of Allahu Akbar and many of ordinary people sort of backing the Afghan forces. Andrew, would you agree that there isn't an inevitability to the Taliban taking over? Because you said the Taliban has the momentum, and Avinash just said, well, it's not a given. This can still be stopped.
Can be stopped.
Andrew, yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
When I say the Taliban have the momentum, that's certainly, I'm certainly not presupposing that they're going to be victorious. But of course, what the Taliban have shown is a lot of strategic patience. You know, they have been building up over 20 years. You know, they were defeated in 2001. And with Pakistan's help, they were able to rebuild and get to this point. So no one, I certainly don't know, Avinash doesn't know, no one knows what is going to happen. Of course, the big fear is that you end up with a stalemate. You know, you end up with a new round of civil war where the Taliban consolidate their hold in the countryside and continue to attack cities. And obviously that is disastrous for the Afghan population. One thing to note, though, and clearly this has been part of Taliban strategy, is the way that they have been taking border points. They took Zaranj yesterday, very important down in the southwest with all the trade, also very important actually as a drugs trading route as well. They get lots of revenue. The government also was getting revenue that way. Is also the route through which the many Afghans who are now leaving the country are also going down that way as a side point. But between Zaranj and the other border points that they have got control of, if they are able to keep control of those, that will obviously give them the ability to squeeze the government, and I'm sure that's something that Ambassador Haidari is obviously very concerned about. It means loss of revenue. It means the Taliban controls supply routes. It means all sorts of things. But back to one other point I just wanted to make in reference to what Avinash was saying. You know, as a Brit, I'm constantly aware of the colonial kind of legacy over all of this. You know, we have the Durand Line is obviously a key part of this. The still unresolved dispute over Kashmir, that is what is so much driving Pakistan's paranoia and the way that it carries on with, a policy that effectively Pakistan has been carrying on for 40 years. It's changed slightly, but in effect, it's driven by the same way of seeing the neighborhood, and as long as that is unresolved, it's very hard to see how things improve.
So let me just jump in there and give the last comments to both the ambassadors. I'll start with you, Ambassador Raghavan, because when it comes to Kashmir, I actually think if there was any space ever possible for a dialogue process, that has diminished. And the rise of the Taliban, if accompanied by this sort of intricate cobweb of terror networks, is going to diminish that space further. I actually do not see any space at all right now for some dialogue process between India and Pakistan. I'm not sure if you agree. And with this government, we have known to be absolutely taken aback. Just when we think the script is going one way, it goes the other way. Ambassador Raghavan, last word on what our Afghan policy will mean for our Pakistan policy, because the two are completely intertwined. Ambassador Raghavan, you're on mute, sir. Go ahead.
The great risk is that a Taliban victory or a near victory in Afghanistan acts as a kind of triumphal moment for different radical groups in Pakistan and some sections of the Pakistani establishment itself. And if one goes back in history, the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 had led to precisely this kind of triumphalism, and we saw the effect of that immediately in Jammu and Kashmir beginning from 1990. So that risk certainly remains. But I don't think one should ever rule out the possibilities of movement on the India-Pakistan front. And in fact, if you look back even at our recent history, at times when that movement has been least expected, it takes place precisely then. And all governments, not just this government, all governments have combined a certain multiplicity of policies when it comes to dealing with Pakistan. So I don't rule out the India-Pakistan dynamic changing. I think it has already changed to some extent in the past few months. But I think also that right now, the situation in Afghanistan has a certain kind of battlefield autonomy, which other factors are not going to be able to change very quickly. To a great extent, the situation is going to be one which has to be resolved on the ground. Until something changes a little bit on the ground, the other levers don't really come into play.
Okay, Happymon, just a brief interjection, and then I'll ask Ambassador Haidari to close. Happymon?
Well, I just quickly in 10 seconds on the Pakistan question. I may have limited experience. Ambassador Raghavan certainly has much more experience, but my own feeling really is that in the Pakistani mind today, they're going to go a little easy and slow on the Kashmir question with the implicit understanding that India is not going to really get into the affairs of Afghanistan. You're already looking at a ceasefire agreement in Kashmir between the Indian and Pakistanis, and you're looking at decreased infiltration. Terror attacks are really on the low. But Pakistan, on the other hand, will viscerally object to any Indian engagement of anything Afghanistan. Even in the past, in various meetings, when Indians have suggested about India-Pakistan cooperation in Afghanistan, the Pakistanis have basically said to the Indians, lay off. The Rawalpindi looks at Afghanistan as its strategic backyard, whether we like it or not, and any engagement of Indians there, be it the Afghan government or the Taliban, the Pakistan is going to say, get the hell out of here. So I don't think we are left with too many choices in terms of talking to the Pakistanis on the Afghan question. To my mind, that's really not getting us anywhere.
That's an interesting dimension. You're almost talking about like a de facto, not exactly a quid pro quo, but a kind of, we won't get over involved in Afghanistan, you lay off Kashmir. Ambassador Haidari, last word to you. One, to Ambassador Raghavan's very important point that it doesn't matter, the diplomacy of it doesn't matter anymore. This is a battlefield-driven outcome. You're on mute, sir.
Andrew's point that this is going to be a civil war, we Afghans have categorically rejected that. There is no civil war. This is a creeping invasion of Afghanistan. We exactly know who the state sponsor is. You've been talking about it, who the, of course, proxies are. So many that I named, and of course, regional and transnational and all of this. And then we need to really ask countries, not just India, but Russia, China, Addison is here. What is it that they're going to really get out of Taliban, say, if they ever came into power, which the Afghan people would never allow? That's why, there's a national resistance movement being formed and already fighting alongside Afghan forces. And these are not just the so-called warlords. These are the Afghan people. If you just go online, as we speak, you will see Afghans of all ethnicities. That's the beauty of it. That's why this is not in the 1990s when the Taliban just rose in Kandahar and they just swept across the, ethnically Pashtun-populated provinces.
Yeah.
This time around, it's different. We experience who the Taliban are. We know who the state sponsor is. The region knows what the Taliban could bring to Afghanistan, much worse than the Stone Age and the medieval era. Then what of the original connectivity, dreams and visions and looking east or looking, south and north, all these things, not just, leave the Taliban out. So last, and we know the experience, of course, when the vacuum was created in Afghanistan, and as a result, we saw what happened 9/11, and that re-engaged. Who would have really, even back in the 1990s, cared? There was violation of human rights and so on and so forth. But the international community in our region learned from the spillover effects that it is in their best long-term interest to stay engaged in Afghanistan. Afghanistan being the, beating heart of Asia. We're just sitting between Central Asia and South Asia, and without Afghanistan being secure and stable, there is no way for China's CPEC to take off, or for India's any vision of looking east or to Central Asia materialize without stability and peace in Afghanistan. That would only happen and materialize if all of our neighbors strengthen the hand of the Afghan state and the Afghan people against this onslaught of,
I hear you, Ambassador. I hear you. I hear you and personally agree with pretty much most of what you've said. I think so does our panel. I think the dispute or the disagreement is only how to get to that point. Nobody disagrees that Afghanistan is at the heart of this, regional security for all of our countries. But we'll have to leave it there. We'll keep a close eye on the situation. Ambassadors Haidari and Raghavan, thank you, and to Happymon, Avinash, and Andrew, pleasure, and to our audience, have a great weekend. We'll see you now on Monday. Take care, stay safe, and see you soon. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.